Hello, welcome to Novara Live. My name is Bastani. Tonight I have the immense pleasure of being joined by the one and only Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are we?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a rare day that we get united on this show, so I'm looking forward to it.
It is a rare day, and I also have to say I'm rather sick still. I didn't have the pleasure of co-hosting on Friday because I have a pretty bad chest infection, but the antibiotics are working pretty well. If I start falling over in fits of asthmatic wheezing and coughing, you know why. I'm sure Ash can pick up where I leave off. Coming up tonight, a Russian general is assassinated in Moscow. Nigel Farage meets Elon Musk. And why Reform UK seem to be advocating for water communism. Stay tuned for all of that and more. But first, a reminder, Novara Media exists because of you, our supporters. We're people-powered and we've proven that our model works. Your support helps us to break stories and challenge the establishment in ways that mainstream media simply won't. So, help us build people-powered media. Donate 1 hour's wage per month or whatever you can afford today. To sign up, go to novaramedia.com/support. The link for that is in the description below. An Israeli strike in Syria has caused tremors the size of a 3.1 magnitude earthquake. On Sunday night, Israeli warplanes bombed military targets in the Tartus region, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Those targets were air defense units and surface-to-surface missile depots. Footage shows explosions followed by a mushroom cloud. The scale of the explosion could be explained by munitions stored within the depot. Extraordinary images. That strike was one of hundreds the IDF say they have conducted in Syria to prevent the former Assad regime's military stockpiles falling into the hands of the rebel coalition. The leader of that coalition, Abu Mohammed al-Jalani, told Syrian state TV this in regards to that attack. The Israelis have clearly crossed the lines of engagement in Syria, which poses a threat of unwarranted escalation in the region. Syria's war-weary condition after years of conflict and war does not allow for new confrontations. The priority at this stage is reconstruction and stability, not being drawn into disputes that could lead to further destruction. The strike on Tartus is also bad news for the Russian Federation. The Russian naval base in the region provides key logistical access to the Mediterranean Sea, but its future is now uncertain. Satellite imagery appears to show 3 Russian warships departing the base between December 5th and December 10th. Russia is reportedly in talks with the Syrian government in efforts to retain the base. Ash, Syria could become a failed state, and it seems like Israel are trying their hardest to make that more likely, aren't they?
I mean, we should look at exactly what Israel has done since the fall of Assad. Its priorities have been the destruction of Syrian military targets, so a weapons depot, the destruction of the Syrian navy, and also unilaterally taking more territory in the Golan Heights, claiming, somewhat implausibly, that they're establishing a buffer zone. Well, guess what? It's supposed to be a demilitarized buffer zone, and ever since 1967. It's a land grab. It's just an out and out land grab. um, this isn't dissimilar to Israel's attempts to unilaterally um, redraw its border with southern Lebanon, pushing Hezbollah north of the Litani River. And of course, what's happening in Gaza is both a genocide and a land grab. That's before you mention what's going on in the West Bank. So this is entirely in keeping with Israel's MO more generally. But I also think it speaks to something really important about the geopolitical balance in the region. Um, to a great extent, America has left a power vacuum in the Middle East. It decided under Joe Biden that it would reorient away from the Middle East and towards Eastern Europe and towards China. That doesn't mean that America doesn't think that Western interests, quote unquote, need to be protected, which really means policed and advanced, and Arab nations destabilized. Um, It's just that they're quite happy to allow Israel to do it in ways which are completely um, in in conflict with international law, particularly when you think about what's happening in Gaza and also the Golan Heights. America's perfectly happy for Israel to do that. What's surprising is that Israel has managed, I think, largely to succeed. Um, Iran's axis of resistance / ring of fire strategy clearly hasn't been enough to curtail Israel post October the 7th. You've seen an acceleration, a quite extreme acceleration of ethnic cleansing and genocide with regards to Palestine. And you have also seen, to a large extent, the decapitation of Hezbollah. Lots of people, including myself, said Israel is going to find it really difficult to fight a war on all these fronts. As you've pointed out several times, Aaron, Israel doesn't have an industrial base large enough to sustain those efforts. But all America has to do is provide military aid. Really, that's what America has to do, and is doing. And what Israel's been able to do is redraw the balance of power in its own favor when it comes to the Middle East. So we're talking about Lebanon, we're talking about Palestinian territories, and we're also now talking about Syria. Will it stay that way forever? I mean, you've got two things to consider. One is the ways in which Iran will readjust and regroup. Its axis of resistance strategy is in tatters. That doesn't mean it's going to stay that way forever. And the second thing to consider, of course, is what happens now that Turkey is a key player when it comes to Syria. And you've got the significant reduction of Russian presence, and also Russia is unable to intervene in Syria the way that it did in previous years simply because it's so bogged down in Ukraine. So all of these things are things to consider. That Israel, I think, very much has emerged a winner geopolitically, and the sort of potential flies in the ointment are what happens when Iran regroups, and what does Israeli-Turkish relations look like when it comes to Syria as well?
Yeah, you've said a lot there, Ash. I think the neo-Ottomanist kind of resurgence of Turkey is a real takeaway from all of this. I have to say as well, in regards to Iran, something I talked about a lot. This is a country which has a lot of the features you'd associate with a successful war economy. Produces all of its own food, lots of domestic steel and iron production, large population, domestic military industrial complex. It should, in theory, be able to take on a power like Israel. But as you sort of insinuate there, Ash, Israel has a blank check from the world's only hyperpower. It has F-35s. It has nuclear weapons. It will get tens of billions time after time after time after time from the United States, specifically the president. They're the people that write these checks. And that's very hard to deal with. Iran, by contrast, doesn't really have an air force. Compared to F-35s, Iran does not have an air force. It has F-14 Tomcats when the Shah was in charge. Probably not good enough. And a few French Mirages too. Ukraine has taken credit for the assassination of a Russian general in Moscow. This morning, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov and his assistant were killed by an explosion as they left a block of flats. Russia's investigative committee says the bomb was hidden in a scooter and detonated remotely. Ukraine's security service has called Kirillov, quote, a legitimate target and, quote, responsible for the mass use of banned chemical weapons. Kirillov was head of Russia's nuclear, biological and chemical defense forces, and in October, the UK government placed sanctions on Kirillov and his unit for, quote, the deployment of barbaric chemical weapons in Ukraine. His assassination comes in the context of a wider intensification in the war between Russia and Ukraine. According to an article published by Al Jazeera, Russia is on a major offensive in order to strengthen the president-elect's argument for cutting Ukrainian aid. In the piece, they write this. Mounting evidence suggests that Russia ramped up its assaults on Ukraine leading up to the US election on November 5th in a possible effort to strengthen isolationists supporting Donald Trump. It also appears to be doubling down on that strategy ahead of Trump's inauguration on January the 20th. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has estimated Russian losses for September at 38,130 and for October at 41,980. Those climbing casualty figures are due to the fact that Russian ground assaults have steadily mounted despite the pain. You should say, of course, in any kind of conflict, numbers are always contested, the fog of war and all that. But it seems quite likely, doesn't it, Ash, that the gloves are off until Trump is inaugurated. That, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, is on January the 20th. Between now and then, we've got a month. Could we see some quite outlandish escalations on both sides in order to embed an advantage?
Well, I think so. I mean, Donald Trump is notoriously difficult to predict. And so I suppose there'll be quite a bit of, reading of the tea leaves on both Zelensky's part and Vladimir Putin to think about what they can do, how far they can go, and what Donald Trump's attitude might be like when assuming the presidency next January. I think that when you look at, for instance, the green light being given for the use of NATO-produced long-range missiles, being aimed at targets deep inside Russian territory. Part of, I think, the gamble being made there is that, well, okay, this is, of course, a huge escalation. It's going to prompt a strong response, verbally from Putin, but there's actually not a huge risk in terms of escalating to the use of, for instance, tactical nukes or something, because Putin won't want to alienate Donald Trump too much when it comes to January, right? What his hope is that America basically forces Ukraine to the negotiating table and to make significant territorial concessions. So counterintuitively, what that escalation on the part of Ukraine and the Biden administration means is that I think that there's a sense that Putin won't want to go too far or retaliate too much, because he won't want to alienate Donald Trump too much. That's not necessarily, I guess, reliable. You talk about Donald Trump being unpredictable. Putin, I think, has also proved to be unpredictable. Lots of people said before the invasion of Ukraine was launched that this is just troop movements, tank movements in order to secure some concessions from Ukraine and from NATO. Of course, that's not what happened. I think that there was some miscalculation there on the part of Western powers. So I wouldn't take what I've said as though it's set in stone. Take it with a pinch of salt, but I think those are the kinds of calculations being made.
With Trump, you never know. It's not a story we're talking about today, sadly. We've got a busy show. But it's now seemingly the fact that Donald Trump, when he becomes president, is going to lobby quite hard for TikTok to not be banned. When he was the president the last time, up until 2020, he was like, we need to ban TikTok, Chinese influence, spying, get it out of the US. That agenda was carried on by the Biden administration. But now Trump is saying, hey, I'm actually quite big on TikTok. I won the young vote. He said this, quote, I won the youth by 34 points. I mean, he didn't. He actually lost. He lost among young Americans. He did surprisingly well, which helps him win. But Kamala Harris did better among young people than him. I mean, who cares? He won overall. The point is this, Trump has completely flipped on TikTok because he's quite popular on it. I mean, this is the kind of guy we're dealing with. You can find that funny. You can find that concerning. You can find it both of them. But it does mean he's a very volatile character when it comes to international relations. We've got 1,800 of you watching. This is the last show I'm hosting this year. And I'm not that well, guys. I'm really, really sick. It's not a metaphor. I have a pathogen in my body, which means I can't perform as I usually would. There are some very mean comments saying, Aaron, stop putting on that stupid voice. If I'm speaking in a staccato way, it's because I'm literally struggling to breathe. If you want to make my life a little easier, if you want to make old Aaron a little happier, go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a new media for different politics. Who knows? Maybe the next time I'm sick, we can get a replacement. That's the kind of organization we're trying to build here. On a serious note, of course, I would never be exploited like that in this organization. We look after our staff here at Novara Media to help us push politics in a better way, however, in 2025, help us deliver that new media which is the necessary precursor for it. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Nigel Farage and his party treasurer, Nick Candy, have met with Elon Musk at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort for the first time since rumours surfaced of a possible donation from the world's wealthiest person. The Reform UK leader Anne Candy, who's also the husband of singer Holly Valance, met Musk yesterday. That meeting came following reports that Mr. Musk was considering donating £78 million to Nigel Farage and Reform as a, quote, fuck you, Starmer payment. Remember, Musk had just donated $277 million to Trump and various other Republican candidates, so he's developing a taste for political donations. Here's Nigel Farage on X earlier today, sharing a picture of that meeting. Britain needs reform at Elon Musk. And you can see that reply from Elon Musk. Absolutely. Notice, by the way, just behind them, there's a picture, I think, of Donald Trump wearing a cricket jumper. Very strange. Farage and Candy have so far rejected assertions regarding any potential donation from Trump. Sky News reports Farage saying this after their meeting yesterday. We had a great meeting with Elon Musk for an hour yesterday. We learned a great deal about the Trump ground game, and we'll have ongoing discussions on other areas. We only have one more chance left to save the world. One more chance! We had two, now we've only got one. Well, when was the last chance that you lost? Was that when the Tories lost to Labour? Okay. We only have one more chance left to save the West, and we can do great things together. Our thanks also to President Trump for allowing us to use Mar-a-Lago for this historic meeting. The special relationship is alive and well. Beautiful Mar-a-Lago! I love Mar-a-Lago. I like it because it sounds like Puerto Rico, which is actually the funniest phrase that Trump's ever said. The Lenin was very good, but Puerto Rico is also quite amusing to me. Ash, how significant is this partnership, this burgeoning partnership between Reform, Farage, not just with Elon Musk, but this coterie really now of Republican funders, media assets, influencers. You know, I can see ahead of the next general election, Farage, as part of the media round, going on the Joe Rogan podcast, right? You know, Little Keir is doing BBC Radio 4 and Nigel Farage is going on to the biggest podcast in the world. It feels fundamentally different to the political landscape in this country, even 6-7 months ago. Where do you think this ends up, and how big a deal is it for the rest of the 2020s?
You know what? I'm not going to make predictions, but what I am going to do is say, here's what to look out for. Because I'm really, really bad at making predictions, but I'm a little bit better when I say, here are the trends that you need to keep an eye on. So the first thing is that I do think it's hugely significant that what Farage and Reform are trying to do is unlock all of this right-wing American money, and not just that, get Elon Musk on side. Why is that important? Well, you look at what Farage was able to achieve with the backing of the likes of Aaron Banks in this country, what he was able to achieve with UKIP and the Brexit Party. Now, these are political parties that didn't have to be huge membership organizations, although, you know, UKIP did get fairly big. What they had to do was run enough candidates which came a close second in Tory seats to transform what it was the government was doing. And they did that exceptionally well. All right, that's what got us to leave the EU, in effect. What's happening now is different. They are not just running a strategy of coming second in a lot of Tory seats. One, it doesn't matter so much because they've won the argument within the Tory party by and large. And two, you've got a Labour government. No, they're really going, they're really going the whole hog, and they're actually trying to win. It's not just about coming second. So they're, I think, going to be, running much more aggressive campaigns now than they did before. And the second thing, and this is why Elon Musk is so important, is that I think they've got an understanding that the same way we say a new media for different politics, I think they also want to, profoundly change and shape the UK media environment. We are not in the media environment of 10 years ago. The first thing is obviously you've got GB News. GB News, their viewership is competing with Sky, sometimes outperforming Sky at the moment. Also, the addition of a dedicated, very right wing news channel means that the legacy channels, whether it's BBC or Sky News or anybody else, they've got a new competitor to their right. So they're obviously going to try and hang on to those audiences. That shifts the discourse more rightwards. And then you've also got this massive potential to reach people through podcasts, through through TikToks. And that's something which I think that Labour just don't understand, nor do they want to understand. I think that when it comes to the Downing Street press team, they go, "Oh, the Today programme were pretty nice to us today. That's great." What they're wanting, basically, they want to do well on media platforms which have declining viewership, declining readership, declining listenership. Right? That's still where the Labour mentality is. And thinking about how to dominate in these other spaces isn't really on their agenda. Obviously, that's a big part of Elon Musk's agenda. That's part of the Twitter takeover to make Twitter useless for the left and liberals and to make it very useful for the right. He understands that that's beneficial for the right by taking over a key piece of media infrastructure. And I think that Farage has a lot to learn there. We know that he's doing well on TikTok. We know that he's very adaptable character when it comes to new forms of media. And that's something which the Labour Party just are being left behind in the dust on. But it's not just the Labour Party. And Aaron, this might be a little bit controversial, so I wonder what you think about it. The Green Party, obviously they've got more MPs than they ever have in their history. They are, however, outnumbered by Reform. But when it comes to competing in new media, I'm not just talking about legacy media, which I understand is biased against the Green Party. It sort of doesn't take them seriously. I also think doesn't take the Lib Dems seriously enough, but doesn't take the Greens seriously. When it comes to new media, the Greens are rubbish. I mean, like they're really, really terrible. I like, when you read some of the comms put out by Carla Denya's team, it's like Lisa Simpson wrote it. I mean, it's just so technocratic and difficult to pass and doesn't tell a clear political story. And it's interesting to me because I know that the Greens internally are thinking, all right, it's not about left, right, it's about bottom versus top. And we've got to be representing the people who feel themselves at the bottom. But they are seemingly unable to embody real anger, real emotion. And they just sort of like fall back into this very technical, very, PMC way of communicating. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Reform don't do. I think they know how to go for the jugular. They know how to go for the gut. And even in my own, shall we say, confrontations with Reform MPs, I do think of them as very formidable communicators because they are. Now, Labour, for obvious reasons which we've discussed again and again and again, Keir Starmer's managerial tendencies, their inability to communicate well because that reflects the weakness of their offering. Reform know that they've got them over the barrel, that they can outcompete Labour in some really key ways. But when it comes to the Greens, I really don't see them putting up a serious opposition to Reform because they just can't seem to embody that style of communication at all.
I think that's a really valuable contribution, and I'm kind of inclined to agree. I think the Greens, the next general election, could get 15 MPs, and that's their approach. Grassroots, heavily localised. Ellie Chowns in Herefordshire, that constituency is enormous. To drive across it takes you an hour. And lots of these people aren't using, social media and the things you're talking about. But if you want to go from 15 to 100, 150, which, by the way, is what Reform are looking to do. Reform have 5 MPs. They're looking to go to 100 plus. Then you need, of course, to master a vast range of media platforms. Now, it's easier for Reform because they have a lot more money. I get it. But I think, Ash, you have a point that the Greens don't necessarily help themselves with how they communicate, where they communicate, their messaging. There are some exceptions. I think Zach Polanski is very good at it. But generally speaking, I think that's right. And I think it's all the stranger because there is this incredibly powerful vibe shift right now in our culture towards green issues. There was that poll last week. We shared it here on Novara. I think we covered it on the show, but it also was on our Instagram. You had more people prefer socialism to capitalism, but then you see the popularity of people who like the idea of environmentalism. Environmentalism is not a left-right thing. By the way, I think a lot of the left gets this wrong. You don't want to make environmentalism left-coded, right? Because then all of a sudden 50% of the public's not going to agree with it. I don't want it to be a left-right thing. Protection for the environment, biodiversity, addressing the climate crisis should not be a left-right thing. Now, I don't think it can be done under capitalism. I think you need a massive amount of state intervention. I think you need real constraints on market forces in some areas. But regardless, it should be something where you can bring lots of people in. And I feel like the Greens aren't necessarily on top of that. You know, I was in Charing Cross recently, Charing Cross Road, you've got Fall's bookshop, and I went into the bookshop, and there was a whole wall of this literature on like green lifestyleism, green issues, nature, wellness. This vibe shift is happening, and it doesn't feel like the Greens are the party of that vibe shift when they should be. You see, you know, Reformer wearing their barber coats, they're talking about nature, yada, yada, yada. The great British countryside, that should be the bread and butter of the Green Party. Or you like animals out there, you like badgers and hedgehogs and polecats and wild birds. You like those things? Well, then you should support the Green Party, because the political economy of Reform, the Tory Party, and indeed to some extent Labour, undermines all that stuff. But they're not necessarily speaking in a populist language, which most people can get on board with. People in this country love David Attenborough. The Greens need to be the party of people that like David Attenborough. You like David Attenborough? Vote Green. Easier said than done, of course, but I think there's something to that, Ash. I would say as well, on Elon Musk, that man is now worth more than $400 billion US. He's seen an extraordinary increase in his wealth since the November election. And the idea that he could donate even £100 million, the figure being bandied around as $100 million, around 78 million pounds, I believe. Even that, which is, it's not even pocket change. I mean, this is the crazy thing, right? That is what, it's 0.3% less, 0.25% of his fortune. That amount of money will transform British politics. I don't think it's possible, even though the plan may be to donate it to Reform via X's holdings in the UK, which would be legal. You can't have overseas nationals funding British parties. You can do it, however, through an NGO or a business based in the UK. You can do that. But I think if you used X in the UK as the vehicle to donate a figure of that kind of size, £70 million plus, I think the Electoral Commission would step in. And again, by the way, I don't think there should be foreign funding of any kind, even with these loopholes into British politics, including Elon Musk. And it seems to me a real potential Achilles heel for Farage and for Richard Tice when you say we're against the establishment and you're with the world's wealthiest person. And this is not about the left hating on success, hating on aspiration. Elon Musk is the world's wealthiest person. And I wonder how much he understands the struggles of working people in this country. Doesn't mean he's wrong about everything. I agree with him on electric vehicles and solar energy. And I don't like this default of, oh, because you're this person, I disagree with every position you have. I don't like that. Don't agree with it. I don't think politically it gets you very far. But I think that, that's the kind of thing. It should be an Achilles heel for Farage. Land some punches on the guy, metaphorically, before this gets clipped and I'm cancelled. I don't mean that literally, speaking metaphorically. Let's go to another aspect of this story. Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Mao, Che Guevara. None of them succeeded in discrediting capitalism as much as Britain's privatised water industry. You probably know the facts by now. Goodness knows how many times I've spoken about it here on Novara Live. When the industry was privatised in the late 1980s, it had no debt. Today, Britain's privatised water companies have £60 billion of debt. 0 to 60. And no, I'm not talking about a car or a Tesla in under 3 seconds. Over that same period, specifically since 1989 and privatisation, £53 billion in dividends have also been paid out by those same companies. So, privatisation has meant more than £110 billion has been taken out of Britain's water industry, and fundamentally, that's money taken away from taxpayers and consumers and funneled directly to shareholders, management, the corporate 0.1%. Basically, the privatisation of water in this country was the biggest con job Britain has ever seen. And today, Thames Water was in court seeking approval for a further £3 billion loan to keep the company going. Just £3 billion, not much. That loan would be from Thames Water's A-class bondholders, who provide £3 billion over 2.5 years at a rate of 9.75%. It seems kind of crazy, right? I'm broke. I just need a loan with a high APR to keep me going. That'll sort everything out. Sounds kind of like me as a 20-year-old undergraduate, but no. We're talking here about a public utility literally everyone in the southeast of England depends on. That bid for credit is just the latest step in a decades-long grift by Thames Water. And while few people in British politics think this is okay or an acceptable way to carry on, neither major party backs public ownership of water. But guess who does? That's right, Reform UK. Richard Tice told the Financial Times last week that the situation at Thames Water was completely untenable. His words. And that financiers were trying to rip off consumers with even more high-interest loans and millions in fees. By the way, all true. Every last word there is true. Here's Tice, quote, "It is essentially bust, that's Thames Water. Capital projects are being delayed and it should be put out of its misery now. There has to be moral hazard. Let it go into special administration for £1 and reorganise it to the benefit of taxpayers and consumers." That's not Jeremy Corbyn or Ash Sarkar. That, my friends, is the Deputy Leader of Reform UK. Here's how Helena, No Justice MTG, put it on X. Nigel Farage endorses water communism. Hey, who knows, maybe that's how the BBC will report this, if that's Reform's position going into the next general election. Ash, a simple question. Why is Reform UK embracing water communism?
Simple answer, Aaron, because there's a lot of votes in it. Reform have looked at what far-right parties have done in other countries, and what they've worked out, and you've said this many times, is that a really successful formulation, if you're an insurgent far-right political force, is stand up for family capital versus corporate capital. So you identify corporate enemies. Now, a traditional way in which that's done is to take on big corporations, whether it's, Disney or Sainsbury's or whoever it is, and say, you've gone woke, and that's why we don't like you. But I think that there's also sort of picking on these strategic fights. And of course, as you said, water privatization is such an egregious example of, the way in which privatization has been a scam on the British taxpayer. Because there's lots of, persuadables who lean right on immigration, but lean left when it comes to something like water privatization. And there's also, this is really important to say, a particular weakness here for Keir Starmer. Now, we've talked about a million times on this show the chameleon-like nature of the Labour Party leader. He says he's in favour of water privatisation. When he's running for the job of leader, he very quickly abandons that and pretends that he never said it when he's going for the job of becoming Prime Minister. But that's not the only weakness that he has. Another weakness is specifically to do with Macquarie. So Macquarie was part of the consortium which bought Thames Water and embarked on a project of debt loading. They massively added to Thames Water's debts. They extracted a load of money for their shareholders and then sold it on, leaving the company loaded with debt laden with debt, I should say. Loaded makes them sound rich, but laden with debt. You've taken a load of money out of the company and then you pass it on to its next owners in worse financial shape. Macquarie, you would think, after having done that to a utility like Thames Water, that they should be persona non grata when it comes to the UK, that no UK government should want to have anything to do with them. Oh, wait, actually, a load of our gas infrastructure has just been sold off to, guess who? Macquarie. When it came to Labour's flagship investment summit, you may be familiar with those photos of Keir Starmer rolling out the red carpet for BlackRock and for Larry Fink. They also did it for Macquarie. So if I'm Richard Tice or I'm Nigel Farage, I would go, this is a great fight for us as Reform, because not only do we get to appeal to some of those left on economics, right wing on social issues voters, of which there are millions in this country, we can also have a go at kicking Labour in the head, because they've literally been rewarding the very same people who got Thames Water into this state in the first place.
Spot on. Macquarie, they're involved in too many things to mention, and BlackRock as well. My goodness.
Oh, is it Macquarie? Is it Macquarie? I've been saying it wrong.
Who knows, Ash? I don't hang out with these people. I have no idea. Could be Macquarie. Look, my name is technically Aaron.
Macquarie, like I've been saying it like Harry McClary from Donaldson's Dairy. So embarrassing.
Could be. My name's Aaron. Literally nobody in my entire life has ever called me Aaron. Okay, including my mother. I mean, Aaron. So that's fine. We pronounce things how we like here on Novara Media. There's a bit of good news for once. British workers are about to hear something we haven't heard much for the last 15 years and just before Christmas. In the 3 months to October, wage growth accelerated to 5.2%. That growth was largely driven by the private sector. That level of growth was up 0.3% on the 3 months to September and is a little higher than some economists had forecast. It also means that wages are growing above inflation, real wage growth, with inflation-adjusted real wages having increased by 2.2%. That means there really will be more money in the public's pocket in the run-up to Christmas. But as ever, what's good news for regular people like you and me is being cast as bad news by city economists. This is from The Guardian's economics editor, Heather Stewart. Britain's bumper pay rises show inflation is tricky to shift. We don't want inflation in wages. Inflation in housing, that's fine. You can have the average house being 15 times the average wage, but no, please, no inflation with wages. In other words, overpaid workers are already being primed to take the blame for inflation dropping more slowly than the city would like. Money Week has gone further still. They're predicting a rise in UK inflation, partly based on these wage growth figures. Now, you'd think the public feeling a little better off over Christmas would be good for Labour, but that's not how the city sees things. The City AM is also predicting a rise in inflation, while anticipating some political blowback for the government. Now, the UK's latest inflation figures are due out tomorrow. November's figures show that in the 12 months to October, inflation had risen to 2.3%, up on 1.7% recorded the previous month. The Bank of England's target, which it's only ever been able to keep steady for about 6 months out of the last 8 years, is 2%. 2%. So when it's below 2%, we can start to talk about cutting interest rates. Above 2%, and we can't. And of course, we're already above 2%, only slightly. And if it goes higher still, then we definitely won't be getting any interest rate cuts anytime soon. I personally think that target should be 3% inflation. I think that's fine, but that's another story we don't have all night. Forecasts for tomorrow's rate are betting on a rise to around 2.5%, hardly anything like the almost 12% we saw at the height of the cost of living crisis. And yet, the city and much of legacy media is indeed conjuring up a crisis. The Telegraph describes a surge in borrowing costs following a wage shock. A wage shock. You're getting richer. You're not getting poorer. It's a shock, guys. I'm shocked. You're not getting poorer. Don't you know you're meant to get poorer forever? And City AM describes workers' wage growth as killing all hopes of an interest rate cut later this week. Last month, the Bank of England cut interest rates to 4.75%. That continued a steady fall in a rate that had been pushed upwards to control spiraling inflation through 2021 and 2022. And while 4.75% is high compared to the period following the 2008 financial crisis, of course, it was basically zero for the best part of, 13 years, it's nothing next to the 7 or 8% of the new Labour years, or indeed the double-digit interest rates of the Thatcher years. Those high interest rate eras are viewed by many, in fact, as periods of economic boom. Rather than blaming slow economic growth on so-called inflationary pressures, like workers' pay demands, maybe it's time to ask whether British businesses have just got too used, dare I say, too addicted to cheap money. But there's also the sense that the fuss isn't just about interest rates or inflation. Rather, it expresses larger fears by business that wage increases indicate a changing economic reality for them under Labour. This is from The Telegraph. The hot wage, it's so hot, they're not getting poorer, it's so hot. The hot wage growth figures will put policymakers on edge after they warned that Reeves's budget risked fueling inflation. A recent survey by the bank found that more than half of British businesses expect to put prices up and cut jobs to cope with the costs of the Chancellor's national insurance raid. You're talking about two separate things here, right? Anyway, with wage inflation already a gnawing problem for the Bank of England, policies unveiled in the budget add to the angst, says Rob Morgan, Chief Investment Analyst at Charles Stanley. The national living wage is also poised to jump by 6.7% to £12.21 an hour in April. I wonder when Charlie last earned that. Adding another pressure that could prove inflationary. Dear oh dear. Wage rises may be a problem for the Bank of England's rigid economic thinking, but neither wage growth nor next year's increase in the national living wage will be seen as a problem by workers. Given it's workers and not businesses that vote, that could prove a win for Labour, despite the media's scaremongering. Ash, I've got more thoughts on this, but you first. It says so much, doesn't it, that we have people talking in tones of panic, crisis, foreboding, simply because Joe Public isn't getting poorer.
Well, precisely. And there's certain kinds of inflation that no one appears to give a shit about. When you have asset price inflation, as you mentioned, when you've got house prices becoming completely decoupled from wage growth, nobody treats that as a crisis. But not just house prices. When you look at the cost of renting as well, and there are many cities in the UK, not just London, but also including Manchester and Bristol and Glasgow, where the average rent increase of new lets is far and away above the rate of inflation. Nobody gives a shit. It's wage growth that's the biggest cause for concern. Now, of course, there is a relationship between wage growth and inflation. It would be silly to say that there isn't. But suppressing wages is not the only means by which you can control inflation. There are other things that governments can do as well. So, for instance, if you have an inflationary crisis when it comes to food, one of the things that the government can restrict is the ability of the finance sector to speculate on the price of staples such as rice or flour or milk or whatever it is, and thus contribute to the price going up because they're inflating the value of it by speculating on it. That's one thing they could do. Another thing is you could implement price controls. You can say, all right, there are certain things that we are going to control the profit margins on. So this idea that every wage increase has to be looked upon with something like, utter horror, because what if this leads to inflation? What that gives away isn't, I think, simply, oh, we want the poor to stay poor. It's we want to make sure that the attitude to inflation is that you can only deal with it by suppressing wages and not by squeezing profit.
I think that's all true. I'd add one more thing, though. The UK has had basically zero productivity growth since 2008. Productivity means output per person per hour worked. It's actually per person, it's gone down in the last couple of years. And in that context, how do you increase profitability if you're not going to get better productivity? How do you do it? Well, actually, you have to increase the rate of exploitation. That's what you have to do. And people are getting richer, so you can't do that. You need people to get poorer if you're not going to increase productivity. And that's a problem, right? Our economic model in this country is addicted to easy money. In other words, it's addicted to very low interest rates, quantitative easing, easy money. We've had easy money for decades, really since the early 90s. It goes into overdrive in the post-global financial crisis era. 0% interest rates, basically, for a really long time. Loads of bailouts to the banks, giving them loads of liquidity so they can chuck that money where they like. We were recapitalizing them. That basically meant they could keep on lending. But what that meant was they could keep on lending to firms and businesses, let me put my little Adam Smith hat on, which weren't productive, right? Because you got so much easy money. So if you believe in capitalism, you believe in something called creative destruction, which is to say that capitalism through competition destroys unproductive firms and rewards productive firms. Because of how monetary policy and easy money in this country has worked over the last 15 years, we've not done that. Now, if you think, I thought Aaron was a leftist. Why is he talking like this? Picture this. Post-COVID, I didn't mention COVID as well, of course. Loads of easy money, loads of cash that went up to assets and asset price inflation. All talked about very authoritatively by Gary Stevenson. Picture this. What is the quintessential image of the modern British economy? It's a TikTok landlord saying, buy an HMO in Barnsley or Rochdale because the banks are giving you free money. They're talking about easy money. They're talking about the monetary policy we've had in this country over the last 15 years. And that's broadly correct, by the way. Easy money, free money, take it. Take it. Which meant that in this country, we have allocated collectively hundreds of billions of pounds to things like HMOs and God knows what, overinflated assets, house prices, and then other things too, of course, rather than productive investments which would generate growth in the future. That's what we've chosen to do. I think in 20, 30 years' time, people will look back at QE, easy money policies which we've had for decades. They'll look back and they'll go, wow, they were dumb. By the way, easy money starts really with Alan Greenspan, 1987. It's called the Greenspan Put. And it's when central banks all of a sudden start saying, the economy is not growing as quickly as we'd like. We need to reduce interest rates, add a stimulus. John Maynard Keynes said, run deficits. Please run deficits when there's a recession. We run deficits all the time. Now, some people might be saying, Aaron, run a deficit. You can run a deficit. Of course you can run a deficit. Run a deficit of 2-3%. If you've got rising productivity, if you've got 1% growth, and you've got 2% inflation, you can do it. The problem is when you run deficits for 25 years, 20 years like we are, and you have zero productivity growth, major problems. Major problems, guys. And sadly, we don't have the right media to explain all of this. That's why we here at Novara Media exist. Support our work. By the way, on all of this, I have a great interview lined up for you guys on the 29th of December with Ruchir Sharma. He is a columnist at the FT, has written a great book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism. We talk about all of this. It's my book of the year. If you've not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe to the channel, hit the notifications because you will not want to miss that conversation with Ruchir on the 29th of this month. George Galloway has always had a way with words. That's partly why, along with Winston Churchill, he's one of 2 MPs to have ever been elected in 4 different constituencies. Yes, really. Galloway's oratory has been indefatigable, perspicacious. And now, the former MP for Rochdale, Bowen Bethnal Green, Bradford West, and Glasgow Hillhead and Kelvin is done with the Arabs. That's it. It's over. Here's Galloway speaking on his YouTube channel last week.
Wow, God bless you. Thank you, May. No, I will never give up. I have many other struggles to fight, and I'll go on fighting them. But I feel that part of my life fighting for the Arabs, with the Arabs, behind the Arabs, alongside them. I feel that that period has now ended. First, the destruction of Iraq, then the destruction of Syria has changed everything for me. So I'll probably begin focusing more on other places. I think the Arabs are a lost cause, frankly, at least for the time being. But thank you for the beautiful call.
The Arabs are a lost cause. I don't think he means Palestine. I mean, who knows? I think, in a way, what he's saying there makes sense. Baathism is dead. It died, obviously, in Iraq with the fall of Saddam. It's now died in Syria too. People call Galloway a grifter, and I think he's very opportunistic on some things. On Palestine, the guy has been very committed to the cause since he was 18 years old. So I don't think he means the Palestinians. Anyway, what Galloway said next was bizarre.
Because such takfiri Islamist fanaticism can never liberate the Arabs, has no wish to liberate the Arabs, doesn't even see itself as Arab. There were only 25,000 fighters in Golani's army, and 5,000 of those were Chinamen. Chinamen! Uyghurs who don't even speak Arabic, don't even know who the Arab music stars whose albums they're burning right now, don't even know who they are. Never tasted Syrian hummus or shakshuka. Don't care for it. They eat rice for their breakfast, you see. 5,000 out of 25,000 are Chinamen.
I've listened to that so many times, obviously, because we're talking about it on the show today. But it is just remarkable. Chinaman! And the fact that, he has this gift. George Galloway, Ash, he can speak he sounds like a boomer Arab nativist. He's like, they don't know what it's like to have hummus for breakfast. They eat rice for breakfast. I can imagine my great-grandfather, who was a Turkish speaker from southern Russia, I can imagine him saying that. I don't trust the Chinese. They eat rice for breakfast. Not nun sangak. Rice, can you believe it? And this is coming from the mouth of a man who's from Dundee. I mean, it's kind of incredible, right?
I mean, yeah, it is incredible. And I think what it shows is a certain selectivity. Now, I think it's not only fine, I think it's really good to look skeptically and critically at HTS. There is this ongoing conversation about to what extent have they left behind their previous affiliations with Al-Qaeda, of course, people fighting with HTS. Some of them also fought with ISIS as well. There's an ongoing conversation about whether or not they're a sort of Taliban-like force in that. What they want to do is come in, reassure Western audiences, but once it's sort of established that there is no more real American interest in Syria, they can sort of do what they like domestically, as long as they don't fund or participate in overseas terrorism. All right, those are all important things to look critically at, and I don't blame George Galloway or anyone else one bit for wanting to look critically at that. But it's one thing to go, oh, okay, well, many of these fighters with HTS, they're not even Arab. Some of them are Chinamen, which is just an absolutely horrible word to use, by the way, unacceptable word. Identifying the fact that many are Uyghurs. But I mean, come on, the forces upholding Assad's regime were Russian. I mean, they weren't Arab either. If you want to think about, other kind of key relationships for Assad, I mean, you had Russia, you also had Iran. I mean, Iranians don't consider themselves Arabs either. They're Arab. You can tell me what it is Iranians have for breakfast. So there seems to be a lot of sort of selectiveness here, which is sort of upholding kind of Arab nationalism and an Arab national identity when it's time to criticize HTS. But suddenly all of that goes out the window when you think about some of the realities of Assad's regime. And I think that the purpose of all of this, what it intends to what it intends to obscure, perhaps, is the fact that regardless of the deep divisions within Syria about who to support and what comes next, regardless of the impact and interventions of of foreign operators, whether they're foreign fighters or foreign governments, including Turkey, the US, Israel, Russia, and Iran, regardless of all of those things, Assad was kept in power by a system of detention, torture, extortion, and war waged against his own people. So to look at Assad as the sort of embodiment of a authentically, Syrian, national idea, and through that embodiment of that idea, a connection to the Syrian people and a regard for their well-being is just clearly untrue. I mean, one of the things that's now emerging is the extent of the Assad family's money, which has been stashed in London banks and funneled through our very own local Channel Islands tax havens, which has been stolen from the Syrian people. So I'm not saying that to be anti-Assad means that you have to be anti-HTS. You have to be pro-HTS, right? Far from it, right? You can be anti-Assad. You can also look very, very critically at HTS. But I think that there is no small degree of romanticization going on, Aaron. But yeah, maybe you could tell me, what do Iranians have for breakfast?
Well, I think it depends on where they're from. I think if you're from the north, you might have something called halim, which I think you also get in South Asia. I don't know. It's kind of like a porridge, and you have lamb with it. Kind of weird. Or you'd have bread with cheese, nuts, herbs, bit of tea, a few eggs. It's a big country, so north, south, all quite different. But yeah, halim, where my dad's from, really, halim or noon sangak with eggs and paneer would be about right. I just, Galloway is just such an extraordinary character, isn't he, Ash? Because it's almost like he's a novelist. His ability to get into the psychology of like a boomer, Baathist, who's 70 years old. The talking, he's literally saying the talking points. They don't know what it's like to eat hummus. Well, nor does a Russian from St. Petersburg, right? Anyway, I thought it was a funny clip. He is a large-than-life character, it's fair to say. This is my last show of the year. Ash, you've been wonderful. Thanks for joining me.
You have been a wonderful host. I think I might be getting your cough, so I'm going to be speaking a bit staccato this evening as well.
There you go. And for people, by the way, saying, Aaron, don't make everybody sick. It's a bacterial infection. It's not contagious. Apparently, if I'd left it any longer, I would have had pneumonia, according to the doctor. There you go. Thanks for everyone for watching tonight. As I said, if you like what we're doing, support our work. Go to novara.com/support. We've got big things coming up in 2025. And of course, we've got big things coming up tomorrow night. So be here at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.